You're live.
Me
We're live.
neither.
Okay, well, welcome. Apparently, we're live. So, hello, welcome to the virtual bookmark. I still look forward to the time when we can have authors come and visit us. It's a dreary Florida day, so just as well, our author is in California. Maybe she's getting more sunshine on the West Coast. We couldn't be much farther apart, end to end, diagonally in the country, but we're thrilled to have you with us on a topic that's near and dear to our heart. Our author is Lisa Napoli, and her book, which I love the title, if you can see it. There we go. More important than looking at me. Susan, Linda, Nina, and Cokie, the extraordinary story of the founding mothers of NPR. And I love that, you don't even have to give last names. Everybody knows who Susan, Linda, Nina, and Cokie are because they've become so important and part of our cultural milieu. It's the 50th anniversary of NPR. It's hard to imagine life without NPR, but it's within my lifetime. And, it seems crazy that there was a time because it seems like such an important fabric of who we are. So Lisa is an author and a journalist and a podcast and a radio person. So this is not her first rodeo writing a book, and she writes about journalism and the media. So you're the expert. And I congratulated you earlier on getting this book out on the 50th anniversary of the celebration of NPR, because I know enough to know about publishing that's a tricky thing to time things so cleverly to actually work to slot into a particular time slot. So I want to turn it over to you, but so tell us why you decided to do this and how you made all these wonderful contacts, because I know you work closely and they approved cheerfully and excitedly. I watched you talk to the women of NPR, and they were all very excited to participate with you. So thank you.
Well, actually, it was an unauthorized book. I did ask them to talk to me when I was starting to write the book, but I didn't ask their permission. I just said that I was doing the book and that I would love for them to talk with me. And initially, Susan Stamberg had said no. But I can get to that in a minute. To your first question, the reason I decided to write this book is because my last book before this one, which I'm sure you have either in stock or can order for people, it's just out in paperback, is about Ted Turner and the creation of the first all-news channel, which actually had some tentacles into Florida, coming down from Atlanta, where CNN's headquarters were and Channel 17's headquarters were, as Ted Turner took over the cable landscape and invented a new form of television. So I had finished that book, and that was near to my heart because I started my career at CNN as an intern, as a teenager in 1981. And I was thinking about what I would write next, and my editor at Abrams said, would you write a book about Cokie Roberts, who had just passed away? And, I was interested in her story. I really didn't know much of her story. I just knew that she was famous, and I was surprised that she had died. And I started looking around and realized that she and the women, Nina Totenberg and Linda Wertheimer, were known as founding mothers, as was Susan Stamberg, who technically is the founding mother of the founding mothers, because she was the first host of all things, a female host of all things considered. And so when I realized after that, the CNN book had come out in time for CNN's 40th anniversary, June 1st, 1980, when I realized that NPR's 50th anniversary, or rather, all things considered, 50th anniversary was May 3rd, 1971, I said to my editor, how about I do that? And he said, if you can get it done in time for us to publish it, yes, you got a deal. So that's how it came about.
Well done and perfectly timed. And I do remember the Ted Turner change too. I remember that we didn't have to just watch the fuzz after midnight, and that was always very exciting to not have to turn into nothing and to get 24/7 news. That was amazing.
Right. At first it was 24/7 reruns and old movies. And then he realized it was such an interesting idea to have all news, anything, or all day anything that he came up with news, and that is a great story. And even if you don't love cable news, I certainly don't. I don't watch it. I recommend the book because it's a really interesting media story, and I'm very, very proud of it. So I hope you'll check it out. But this book is something I'm proud of too. And, people have a different relationship with NPR than they do with cable news after the last years in the world. And it's been fun to see how people reacted, including the women who are still alive, who did endorse the book, or at least, tacitly endorsed it by joining me for some early book events when the book first came out. So that was a really nice honor that they supported it.
Well, I want to get into all of that because it's not just a book about NPR, but it's about a book about women in the media and women just in general in society. But before we do that, I want to ask you a question, since you are a journalist, about the difference between writing for journalism and writing a book, because it's not the same.
Great question. I'm glad you asked it. Yes. I found it. This is my fourth book, and I found that people really don't get the difference. And, even journalists don't really understand the difference. If you pick up any work of nonfiction, or most works of nonfiction, especially if they're biographies, and look in the back, there are tons of footnotes and tons, a bibliography and sources listed, hundreds of articles, hundreds of videos that people can, sometimes mine if you're writing about a contemporary subject. And that's the big difference between journalism, where you typically observe, or sadly, much of journalism these days is just repeated from wires and, other sources, not from going out and observing it. Whereas biographies or nonfiction books go and survey over months or a period of years all kinds of materials, and then add to it with interviews with people who may have been alive or may be familiar with that period of time. So it's a much broader and more expansive inquiry than writing an article. Of course, articles are the mainstay of what somebody like me does. I mean, writing about the 70s and the women's movement and the creation of public broadcasting and these particular women specifically, I was so fortunate that I mined all kinds of archives and found incredible articles written by many wonderful journalists over the last decades that sort of put me in that moment in time. But it's different than writing an article yourself. Obviously, you have a lot more time, hopefully, and it's a much broader mode of inquiry.
So did you enjoy the freedom of the scope, or did it seem daunting to you?
I love the freedom of the scope. I've been a journalist since I was 20. I'm 57 now. I've worked in the field for a long time in very many aspects of it. And at this stage of my life, I absolutely love this huge expanse that you have and have to deal with when you're writing a book. It's a weird puzzle. It's a different sort of puzzle than writing an article on Deadline or writing a news story on Deadline. I used to work in public radio, and writing a news story on Deadline briefly is a terrific challenge, but it's completely different than having hundreds of pages and having to keep track of all sorts of materials and to think about something and keep thinking about something and sort of put it into context in a different way than you could do with journalism, just because there isn't the time typically.
Well, one more question on this, because I remember years ago we had an author who was a journalist and wrote novels, and he made an interesting comment that he loved his editors for his books, but he hated his editor for the newspaper. So did you have different relationships with your editors?
Oh yeah, I've had some terrific editors in journalism. At the New York Times, I had an incredible editor. But writing a book, it's a whole different relationship. You're doing one big project rather than a series or many, many dozens or hundreds of shorter pieces. So it's a whole different thing. And it's unfortunate that that person had that experience. Um, that hasn't been my experience. I've been very lucky with the editors I've had of books. Most of the time when you write a book, most of the time, the person who's bought the book from you is your editor, your main editor of the book. And so that person has to love the project from the get-go. And when you write nonfiction, you have to write a significant amount of it before you sell it. So it's a whole different world. And I guess I'm sure there are different people have different relationships. So,
well, I'm glad it's a good one because it does make the book sing. And nonfiction should read like a story as the same way as a novel is. It's just a story that's true, but it's still a story.
Right. No, and that's always the best compliment that we can get as nonfiction writers is that it read like a novel. That's great. Yeah. Read like a novel, but it's factual.
That's my kind of nonfiction. So let's talk about these amazing women. This is really a story both of opportunity and obstacles. So these are women who, as Tammany Hall would say, I seen my opportunity and I took it, who made these opportunities, but they had a lot of obstacles to overcome. What's the history of that in terms of women?
Well, I said I was 57 going on 58. These women are 20 years older or a little bit more in Susan Stamberg's case. And I was surprised to know, as someone who entered the workforce in the 1980s, just how bad it was in the 60s and 70s for women. I knew from my mother that women didn't have a terrific or easy time of it. I'm from a different family. These women, both separately. My mother had told me that things were tough for women, but I didn't realize just how hard it was until I started researching these women trying to break into journalism, which my family was not involved in any way. And the idea that women were not seen as authoritative enough to report the news, either for print or certainly on the air. So learning that about the women, despite the fact that 3 of them had gone to women's schools, colleges, Nina famously dropped out of college, but the other 3 women, Susan went to Barnard and Linda and Koki, independently of each other, went to Wellesley. So fine schools. And they still couldn't get jobs in journalism because it was just seen as impossible to put a woman on the air. Susan got out of Barnard and was a typist. So that was surprising to me. And while they certainly didn't have fierce obstacles in terms of racial prejudice or financial obstacles, because they all, 2 of them were not from wealthy families, but they always had support in their lives. But they just definitely bumped up against this belief that women should only go so far, or that women were bad hires because they were eventually going to get married and then eventually get pregnant and then leave. So why would you invest in a woman? I think it's really important. And that's why I think this story is an important one for younger people to see, even younger than I'm saying I was surprised. I think women who are much younger would really be surprised, especially in the face of all the Me Too movement now, just what women had to go through to get jobs.
Yeah, well, I'm in between you and Susan in terms of my age. And Susan and I, one of the things we bonded over is we both graduated from Barnard at different times, but had different experiences. Obviously, that 10 years made a difference, but it wasn't your experience, So I think that the younger generation is surprised by silly things like you couldn't wear pants to work. I think they talked about you couldn't wear certain kinds of jewelry or too much adornment to work. And there were things that you had to do physically and things that you had to put up with. You talk about Me Too. That's like nothing compared to what people were going through in the 50s and the 60s and continuing today. But that was just part of the world in those days.
Sadly, yes. Yes. And these women all took it, and they were not happy about it, but they were used to men either touching them not necessarily in a sexual way, but in an inappropriate way. And, used to men saying, we can't hire you because we have a woman already. And whereas today you would challenge it or go to HR or go on Twitter. These women just knew that that was unfortunately the way it was, and they just soldiered on as much as they possibly could. I mean, it's hard to imagine that anybody would tell Nina Totenberg she couldn't do a story, but that's what happened to her as a younger woman, for sure. So it was a lot of timing and luck that they wound up at this little scrappy upstart that really had a hard time at the beginning, NPR, that really couldn't afford to discriminate against them.
But when you talk to them, I mean, you can recognize their voices. You don't even have to, be introduced. You just hear the voice. You hear Susan's laugh, or you hear Nina Totenberg, or any of them. They have such distinctive voices when they come on the radio. But that was an impediment as well. So talk about that, the voice of God that comes. I mean, there's one thing to say women didn't have the authority, but there was also that notion that you had to sound like God coming on from on high when you talked on the radio.
Yes, yes. Well, it's so interesting because I think it's really hard for people to remember a time before public radio, non-commercial radio, or a time when we had a oversaturated media landscape. But back when NPR started, there were just those three broadcast networks, and they dominated entertainment and news. Everything we watched on the air or listened to on the air. And it was a certain sort of tone and style of delivery and presentation of the news. I get into it in both these books, the CNN book and the NPR book, about how there were a number of people who were concerned about this stranglehold that ABC, NBC, and CBS had on our mind share. They were pumping out stuff, and that was all people could watch or see or listen to. And when NPR started, the whole point of public broadcasting, the whole reason that President Johnson decided to launch public broadcasting was because there was this grave concern about the dominance of the radio and television networks, the three networks, on our mind share. And one of those things, as you point out, was that the news was delivered same time every night. The news was a loss leader. It was seen like an eat your vegetables kind of proposition. Nobody really cared about news the way they do today. I mean, that's not fair to say, not nobody, but the average person didn't, tune in to find out headlines, and they couldn't have anyway at all moments in time, because the news was delivered on a platter at dinner time, usually on television and radio, a little bit more often than that. And it always sounded the same. You might like Walter Cronkite more than you might like Harry Reasoner, but that was what your choice was: a white guy in a suit with a certain sort of demeanor, authoritative demeanor, delivering this news to you. So the idea that a woman could deliver serious news was so mind-blowingly unusual. It was definitely a what do they call it, a purple cow, or a unicorn, that it took the people who were starting public radio, who were entrusted with public radio. And there's a lot in the book about how public radio almost didn't come to be, really was intended in the very beginning just to be public television. So it was so marginalized and underfunded. And these people who just were passionate about radio, which was called the hidden medium at the time, nobody really cared anymore about it, as television had become this dominant force. The people who got their hands on public radio, thankfully, agreed that it shouldn't mimic what was happening in commercial broadcasting. And because of that, there was more leeway for experimentation and for women to walk in the door. And walk in the door and get their voices.
Yeah. There's another thing about women, and particularly at that time that you address, and how they come together and help each other. It's not this competitive, cutthroat world of, well, now you're here and now I'm going to fight with you and we're going to compete over the same job. It's really this notion that we're all in this together and that we're going to help each other. And I think that started at that time and hopefully is something that continues.
Well, it doesn't. I mean, it is a pretty cutthroat place, public radio. I think that it's front facing, uh, demeanor is that it's a sisterhood but it's a very cutthroat place, and it wasn't as if these four women necessarily loved all their colleagues. There, were some instances of women who uh, didn't jive with these women. Nina Koki and Linda in particular. So I don't want to paint a picture that it was big kumbaya. These four women in particular have been incredibly supportive of one another, and they were committed, since they were able to make inroads in ways that other women or women historically couldn't, to helping other women, younger women, when they came in. But it wasn't unilateral, and it wasn't universal for sure. And I don't need to get into that here, but I just don't want to leave the impression that it's just this perfectly unscathed place. But they definitely, to Koki's end, and today, these women were incredibly tight with each other. It's amazing to think that Linda Wertheimer came. She was a grocer's daughter from Carlsbad, New Mexico, and worked so enormously hard to get to the point where she got on the air at NPR after coming in as a behind the scenes person. And that Cokie Roberts, who was the daughter of a congressman and a congresswoman from Louisiana, from a storied political family and huge, immense privilege, when she walked in the door, you would have thought that Linda Wertheimer would want to trip her, because there was her career going out the door. And Linda says that she was worried in the beginning, but Cokie and she bonded so quickly. I mean, it was like a friendship that was meant to be. So they transcended that and any sort of inherent concern that Linda might have had. And actually, initially, Cokie, and the story of Cokie is so interesting if you love Cokie Roberts, because she really didn't have this great ambition when she got out of school to become Cokie Roberts, become what she became. She sort of literally accidentally back-ended into it, and she really didn't want to come back to Washington, D.C. or cover politics. So I find that, and I get into that in the book, I find that to be particularly interesting because, today, a young woman getting out of graduate school, or a young person getting out of school, would have to go on to graduate school and have to aspire to become someone at National Public Radio and jump over so many hurdles to get there, because there's so many other people who are competing for the slot, especially the on-air slot. But when these women entered the public radio system, there weren't that many people trained or interested in radio news to fight with, to combat with. It was a whole different landscape, both journalistically and because public radio was so nascent, such a nascent medium, and because these women had their ambitions not even tamped down by the field. In Cokie Roberts' case, she unabashedly said that when she graduated from college, she had one thing on her mind, and that was to get her boyfriend to marry her. That's all she wanted, was to get married, because she was going to all the roommates' weddings, both hers and her boyfriend from Harvard, and she just wanted to get married. So to think that from the time she graduated from college till her last breath, may she rest in peace, she had this transformation into this ardent feminist, this promoter of women. But it wasn't the linear course that you would expect or hear from a young journalist today.
Yeah, and
which is what I think makes it so interesting.
Yeah, and I think what makes it interesting is really the relationship that the four had, that they stuck together and they supported each other, that Cokie and Nina figured out a way to divide the world, and that they figured out how to deal with parenting. I mean, not a new not a gone away question now how to balance, work and having children. And they all supported each other. They would cover for each other and they would do all that wonderful stuff. So I think that unity
Right.
of women was of a time and a place that hopefully persists, because I think that makes such a huge difference. And you do talk about that a lot, and I appreciate that in your book. So
Yeah, and it's interesting too because today the media landscape is so ferociously competitive that that kind of mentality would be very difficult to navigate. But because they were pioneers in the field and because the field they were in, public radio, was just developing, it was possible. But today, with the 24-hour news landscape and the hyper competitiveness, it's a whole different situation.
yeah, that's a shame.
Yeah,
I have lots
yeah,
of questions,
it's a
and I'm
shame,
happy
but
to
it's
keep
the
going
reality.
on. But I invite other people to. You can type in your questions where it says "ask a question," or on the side where it says "say something nice." If it's not nice, we may not answer it. But please feel free to share your questions or comments so that we can have Lisa address those while they're hopefully, pondering and thinking what they want to ask. Talk to me a little bit too about what's the future. Everybody talks about media is in trouble, print media has its problems, but radio news has its problems as well. And so, what do you think the future of NPR and radio news is?
Well, I don't, of course, have a crystal ball, but I did work at the New York Times in the late 90s, early 2000s, covering the rise of the internet, which was then becoming a commercial populist force. And I later worked at MSNBC and MSNBC.com. I was one of the first people to do hybrid news there, both on dual platform news. Excuse me. So at the New York Times, I worked on this section for the web that was web only, which was a wacky and innovative universe when I was part of it. So I'm used to seeing places, and I described before that I worked at CNN in its early days. So I think every time a new technology comes along, everybody's worried that it's going to kill the old technology.
Right.
And of course, we have seen so many wonderful papers die and truncate. That the newspaper world is decimated, but the big, strong brands survive. And I think that that's what's going to ultimately happen with NPR as it morphs and changes in the podcast space. It's a leader in the podcast space. I don't think it's number one, but it's one of the most popular creators of podcasts. So everybody in that medium is thinking about how to pivot with this new world order where you can time shift when you listen to news or how you listen to news. You do it on Alexa, you do it in the car with satellite, or you listen to the shows you like when you want to. So certainly I don't, of course, I would never say I knew what was going to happen, but I have seen in each of these instances, the good brands figure out, they have the best minds working on it, and they figure out how to move over and maximize the new media, or the new technologies that are
Right.
there. So
And
I
you're
remember when
suggesting
the
that
music
would be
industry
podcast.
was
Yeah.
freaking out. Well, yeah, I mean, I think podcast is one of the major threats to terrestrial radio, listening to the radio live. But I remember covering as a journalist at the New York Times the whole release of music digitally when that first started happening, and how the music industry was so freaked out about it, understandably. And it took a while to sort it out. But of course, now it's a whole different industry creating music. And of course, there's so much nuance. Same thing with book publishing. So people figure it out. It just takes a while. It's an unsettled period, but I don't think it's going to go away. It's a business worth hundreds of millions of dollars, public radio, probably more than that if you tallied up all of the individual stations around the country, which of course are financially separate from the mothership NPR. It's not gonna go away, I don't believe.
And how do you think, I mean, there's so much trust in NPR. I mean, how do you think that it functioned during the pandemic? Do you think that added to its longevity? Because certainly people turn to NPR for, clear, concise news where the words paint the picture, as Susan would say.
Right. Yeah, I personally don't consume a lot of broadcast news of any sort. And it certainly seems to me that people love their public radio and they give to their public radio. I know that there's issues right now. There's a lot of talk about diversity and inclusion in public radio stations around the country. So that's a crisis point for the medium. And I know that there's, concerns with underwriting that hasn't come through, meaning advertising. Underwriting is public radio speak for that. But yeah, I am an independent historian, and as somebody who's just looking at it as an observer, I think, it's a fierce. If I was a marketing PhD candidate, I would say the whole ecosystem of public media is a fascinating entity to study and look at, and it seems like there's a very, very loyal audience. So, yeah.
We have one listener who says, I love the descriptions of the friendship. Was there any particular story you heard that made you wonder how they kept moving forward, both the women and the station, I would imagine she's asking.
I think the women got that they had landed at a place that really appreciated their work. And as a veteran of a number of startups that have failed, I know it's exciting when you go to work for a place and all cylinders are firing and you really feel appreciated both inside and outside. And in all of their cases, they were going to work every day, and they had this privilege that most people don't have, which is that their work was consumed by many people. At first, it wasn't that many people, but they still were receiving fan mail or input from people who were listening. When they, for Linda and Cokie, when they were going to Congress, when Nina was running around all over Washington, D.C., covering everything at that point, not just the legal system. And so they knew, and Susan was getting rafts of fan mail. So they knew that people were listening to them, and they knew that people were saying, for the most part, there were people, of course, who were critical of them, but they were, for the most part, saying, we love you. We think you sound great. We think you sound authoritative. We trust you. And that certainly when Cokie got chosen to work for ABC on the Brinkley Show, and that elevated her to new heights. Before that, she and Linda worked in public television, and they developed a whole new fan base there. So, it's a real privilege when you're on the air and you can have people give you input and feedback, and that feeds on itself and makes you want to keep going, for sure. So I think that's what kept them going, even though there were people along the way who weren't entirely positive or might be sexist or dismissive. Yeah.
So what message, what do you want people to get from this book? What is the story that you want to tell, that you want them to understand? Are there any particular things you want us to focus on, or, that were important to you to be sure they got out?
I think it's really important for people to understand media history. And I know that doesn't sound very sexy, but, and certainly history in general, I think is immensely important, especially more current American history. And the media are so essential to our daily lives. And I include the internet and digital things in that, along with radio and television and newspapers and magazines, that I really have loved, from my first book, which is about the impact of mass media on the little tiny kingdom of Bhutan, considered the happiest place on earth, where happiness changed immensely once television was allowed in. And my
Oh,
next
no.
book was about Joan Kroc and the great philanthropist, and how she gave, uh, the lion's share of her fortune away to incredible and progressive causes. She loved and supported public television and radio. Um, to how I decoded the creation of the first alt news cable channel, and now the creation of NPR. I think it's just really important for people to take a look at how these institutions that are iconic, even if you don't love them. McDonald's, Joan Kroc, I'm not a big McDonald's consumer, but I learned so much understanding how fast food exerted its stranglehold on the American psyche. I needed to learn that to understand where Joan's fortune came from. So there's no one message, but I do believe that people really, it really behooves us to understand how we got to this wacky, nonstop media environment that we're in now, because it didn't happen overnight, and it's been an interesting incremental time. And for people who love public radio to understand that there was, the real narrative of this book, or the real drama of this book, is how public radio almost exploded or imploded in the early 80s. And I feel like that's important for people to see, that it wasn't out of the gate this fully formed individual, the people weren't fully formed individuals, nor was NPR. It almost fell apart, and these women almost didn't get jobs. And I think that's really interesting.
So before we let you go, can we peek into you don't have a crystal ball, but maybe you could tell us, what are you working on now? Or is it a secret?
No,
I want to
no,
know,
it's
even
never a
if it
secret.
is a
I'm
secret.
working right now on a book about, even if it is a secret, I'll tell you.
That's right.
I'm working on a book about the origin of the civil rights movement.
Ah,
April 9th, 1939. And an incredibly important concert given by then the most famous singer in the world, Marian Anderson, who happened to be Black and happened to be unfortunately marginalized because of that, even though she was considered by the people who knew music to be the greatest singer in the world of her time. So her story is really interesting. People have written about her before, but I'm going to focus on that day, April 9th, 1939, as a pivotal moment in the civil rights, in sparking the modern civil rights movement. So I love origin stories. I love biography, but I really love the birth of, 24-hour news, the birth of public radio, the birth of McDonald's, and how it, spawned this amazing philanthropist's life. So that's what I'm going to focus on next.
well, I think it's interesting, as you say, you love biography, because it seems to me that you have this wonderful way of finding the people and then creating a story around them that's so much bigger than just them, although they're certainly worth a big story in their own right. But whether it's civil rights or media or NPR or 24-hour news, I mean, you just get us attached to a person. That's the read like a novel. You get us attached to the person, and then the story just expands from there.
Super. Thank you so much. That's the best compliment ever. And that is a big difference with journalism, is that you write a profile of someone as a journalist, you spend a period of time with them and then you're done. But when you write a biography of someone, you're immersed in their lives, and it's just such an exciting and just completely consuming passion, and it goes on and on. I'm hearing Marian Anderson's voice in my head all the time now, and it's exciting to do it. It's a fun process. It's a crazy process. Only certain crazy people could do it. But I love it. So thank you so much, and thanks so much for helping me help support your store by coming out. I hope everyone buys lots of books from you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the gift of all these wonderful stories and telling them so well. We get to be the happy recipients and readers. And thank you. You sent us book plates, so people should know they can buy the book. And this is what I call the collectors, pandemic collections, they will be the books that are signed by Bookplate. And I think that will be an important marker of this time period. I mean, we can't pretend that it's not going on. And that's going to be what's going to define that period as a book collector. There'll be book plates instead of, signed book pages.
I'm so glad that you said that, because I've thought that every single time I've signed a book plate in the last 6 months or 3 months, whatever it's been since the book came out. It's exactly true. There's so many, one thing that got me through the pandemic, besides being busy with writing this book, was thinking about all the strange little tidbits of history that, there's all these awful tidbits of history too, the terrible statistics and all of that. But these mile markers are going to make somebody's life as a historian down the road. I kept thinking, when I saw, if I ever saw a baby, I would think that baby in 50 years might, have a PhD and go through, masks that he finds in some elder relative's possessions and see the, there's so much interesting and terribly strange and of course devastating stuff that the quirk factor will be huge. So yes, but the book plates from 2020, 2021, absolutely super strange. Yeah.
And reading books is what got most of us through this pandemic. So we thank you for your good books. I just hope that with the next one, you'll be able to come visit us on our coast. The bookstore is a half a block from the ocean. See the Atlantic instead of the Pacific for a change. We invite you to come see us and hope that you can do that. In the meantime, we thank you so much for everything and for letting us visit with you this evening. So it's our evening, your afternoon, but we thank you for your time and everything you've given us. It's a great gift.
Thank you. You're terrific, and continued good luck to you. And I will be there. Don't worry. You won't have to ask me twice.
Good. Keep in touch. Stay well and healthy. And thanks to everybody for listening. Bye. I look forward to seeing you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.